in the pandemic. And so if you look at Alberta, if we go back a slide, please. If you look at Alberta, what you'll see is that the majority, 56.5% of centres in Alberta were receiving no government funding during that reference week. And if you look at the bar in Ontario, it's 9%. If you look at the bar in British Columbia, it's 8%. And the reason it's different is because those provincial governments approach their early learning and childcare sectors differently during the pandemic in terms of the support that they provided. What the government of Alberta decided was that it was unable to provide any government support to those centres that are closed. So when they're looking at the revenues, the loss of government funding for centres in Alberta was very significant, and it was very different by comparison to other jurisdictions. If we can get the next slide, Laura. And what the survey really focused on, in addition to the current situation 6 weeks into the pandemic, it was saying to services, will you be able to reopen? So when we get through the pandemic, as Leah said, we're getting through it now. When we get through it, will you be able to reopen? And again, Alberta centres were less confident in their ability to reopen than centres in other parts of the country. So if you look at the top line there, 56% of Alberta's centres said, yes, we're definitely going to reopen. That compares to 71% in BC and 66% in Ontario. Conversely, 1 in 5 of Alberta centres that were closed during the pandemic, and the majority of them were closed, 85%, said that they're not sure about whether they'll be reopening, or they're probably or definitely going to remain closed. And this is double the proportion in BC and in Ontario. And so what explains that difference? Why would early learning and childcare centres in Alberta be twice as likely to say that they're not sure they're going to be reopening? And again, it relates to that absence of government funding during the period of the pandemic, those initial 6 weeks. On a good news front, 64% of family childcare homes say that they will definitely reopen. So family childcare homes which didn't close or did experience lower enrollments, they're feeling more confident. But again, 1 in 4 of closed family childcare homes are unsure about reopening. And what those figures suggest, this is like almost any good research, which services, which centres are the ones that are most at risk of closing? Who are those centres that are facing the most challenges? And unfortunately, we don't know that answer at this point, but that's a very significant number. If I can get the next slide. Laura, what happened to early child educators? Well, again, if you look at the chart there, what you'll see is that Alberta was the province in which it was most likely that Alberta centres laid off all of their staff, not just all of their frontline staff, but all of their administrative and support staff as well. And so again, in Alberta, the absence of government funding resulted in very, very significant layoffs of the workforce. So Alberta, over 56% again of centres laid off all of their staff. Compare that to the bar in Ontario, less than 20%. Compare that to the bar in BC, 20%. So in Alberta, Alberta was the province in which staff were laid off. Basically, centres had no resources to retain and support their staff teams during the first 6 weeks of the pandemic. And what that means is going forward, it's going to be very much more difficult to reopen and resume services. Look at that first bar. It's not only frontline staff who are laid off, it's also the administrative, the executive director, the program supervisors. So those staff have not been in place now for the period of the pandemic. Where did those staff go? Well, those staff, the majority of the staff who laid off applied for the Canada Emergency Response Benefit or applied for EI insurance. So can I have the next slide, please, Laura? What challenges do centres anticipate around reopening? And just to put it in the big context, across Canada, early learning and childcare sectors are saying we face very significant challenges around reopening, and we face very, very significant longer-term challenges around recovery. What the centres in Alberta said, 9 out of 10 of them said, we're going to face problems with lower enrollments, and we're going to face problems with health and safety costs. We're also going to face physical costs around the costs of reopening. If you've closed a program for 2 months, for 4 months, for 6 months by the time we get to September, there are very, very significant costs of reopening. If we look at reopening with lower enrollments, what that means is we're going to have a new business model in early learning and childcare in Alberta. We're going to have a new business model in terms of how do parent fees and government funding cover the costs of operating at reduced capacity. How do government costs or government fees, resources, and parent funding cover the costs of additional health and safety costs? We're going to have different business models. So centers are very clear that there are very significant challenges around reopening and recovery. And the same for family childcare homes. Again, perhaps a little bit less, but 7 out of 10 Alberta family childcare providers anticipate problems around lower enrollment. The lower enrollment speaks to their business model. Is their family day home business viable if indeed they're serving less children? How are they going to meet higher health and safety costs? So can I have the next slide, please, Laura? Which takes us ahead to trying to think through what does looking ahead look like for the early learning and childcare sector in Alberta. And I think if I was to say one thing about the early learning and childcare sector in Alberta and about the early learning and childcare nationally is that this pandemic, this is an unprecedented challenge and an unprecedented situation. I would suggest that none of us, no matter how long have we been involved in the field, have anticipated or experienced anything like this pandemic. So it's an unprecedented challenge. And using the survey results, we can start to look ahead and say, what are the nature and the scale of the challenges that are facing the early learning and childcare sector? And if you look at that initial second line there, the Government of Alberta relief package at the moment, it was released at the beginning of May, includes around $18 million over 3 phases to support reopening and perhaps something into recovery. As part of the announcement today, the federal monies that were rolled over from the bilateral, there's an additional $10 million that are being allocated to support reopening as part of phase 3. So what that means is we've got $30 million to support reopening in early learning and childcare sector in Alberta. Is that enough? Well, nationally, the numbers that have been thrown around say that the costs of reopening and recovery for childcare sectors across the province are in the billions. So when we look about the costs of reopening the early learning and childcare sector in Alberta, numbers of the scale of 10 in the tens of millions are probably not sufficient. What we're probably looking at, if we're talking about realistically opening and recovering, we're talking about levels of investment that need to be in the hundreds of millions. We are talking about a $1 billion sector that currently the money that's been allocated for reopening is $30 million. I'm not sure at the moment, based on all of the information that's come forward from providers, that 30 million is sufficient to support reopening and recovery. What are the anticipated challenges? A lower enrollment. We're going to have lower numbers of children in regulated, high quality early learning and childcare sectors. That's going to change the business model. That means that we're going to have to look at new models of financing for the delivery of services. We're going to have very significant additional health and safety considerations. And these are hard costs, that is, what is the cost of cleaning and sanitation, but there's also staff allocation costs. Are we going to allocate non-contact staff time to support health and safety concerns? How are we going to do that? That's going to require additional costs. And we've also got very significant costs around how do we return and retain early childhood educators. Remember, in this province, 56.5% of centers laid off all of their staff. How are we going to get those staff back? And how are we going to support them when they come back? Are there going to be incentives to support them? Or is there going to be additional training and support to how to work in COVID environments? What do we do when staff become sick? Any situation in a new COVID environment post-pandemic, if a staff member is sick or presents as having some minor symptoms, that staff member will be required to withdraw themselves from the workplace. How are we going to cover those costs? So we're going to have very, very significant costs. If you look at the bottom bullets, what we've got there is some sense of trying to understand what monies are currently potentially available to support reopening and recovering. So they've got 3 line items there. Firstly, the unallocated provincial monies. And this is an area where there's great uncertainty. What we know is that in the provincial budget that was passed prior to the pandemic, there was about $180 million that was allocated for subsidies, and there was about $125 million allocated for wage enhancements. So we are now 4 months into the pandemic. We've had 85% of services shut down for 2 months. We've now been reopened for 2 months, and we've reopened for 2 months and we're running at 20% capacity. We have 50% of centers that are open, at 40% of enrollment. So what we should have in the provincial budget, we should have unallocated monies for subsidies, $15 million per month times 4. We should have unallocated monies for wage enhancements, 10 million times 4. We should have unallocated budget monies that we can put towards reopening and recovery. What that amount is, I think that's the amount of money that the minister and the ministry need to provide clarity on. Could be 25 million, could be 50 million, could be 100 million. What amount of monies that were allocated in the provincial budget prior to the pandemic have not been expended that are now available to support reopening and recovering? That number needs to be made clear. The second number is the one-year bilateral agreement, the rollover money. And so for those of you who watched the announcement today with Minister Schultz and Minister Hussein, what they were talking about is the one-year rollover of the bilateral agreement. So Alberta signed a 3-year bilateral agreement just over 3 years ago, which provided the province $45.6 million per year to support primarily the $25 a day early learning and childcare sites that were introduced. That agreement is now complete. The money is in place for 1 more year of delivery of the federally funded early learning and childcare sites. But today, what Minister Schultz and Minister Hussein spoke to was how will a 1-year funding of $45.6 million be used to support the sector. So an additional federal investment of $45.6 million. And the way it was described to me, I was looking at it thinking, this is kind of business as usual funding. This is, we're going to allocate the bulk of the money to support subsidies. And we could have a debate whether that's a good use of money to support a sector. But it's a business as usual funding of 30 million for subsidies, 10 million for inclusion, and 4.7 million for staff training and enhancements. What possible use can be made of subsidies if centers aren't open and spaces aren't available? Is that the most appropriate use of this money at this particular point in time? So I think it's more of a business as usual suggestion of use of funding that I'm not sure appropriately fits where we're at in terms of opening and recovery. The other question that remains is that when the government announced its budget in February, the budget for childcare was $394 million, which included, again, $180 million for subsidies, 123 for wage enhancements, and $10 million for inclusion. The money that was announced today was an additional $30 million for subsidies and included an additional $10 million for inclusion. Is that the money that's already in the budget for the current fiscal year, or is that additional money? So now, do we have 180 that was announced in February plus 30? Do we now have 210 for subsidies for the current fiscal year? Because the money that was announced today is intended to be spent within the 2021 fiscal year. So if we talk about reopening and recovery really taking place in September, are we going to be able to expend $180 million or $210 million in subsidies prior to March 31st, 2021? Same with inclusion. When we announced in the budget $10 million to support inclusion in February, $10 million in the provincial budget, we now have an announcement of $10 million today. Does that mean now we have $20 million to support inclusion? Or is that $10 million that were announced today as part of now to be federally funded, is that the same money that was announced in the spring? So I think we need clarity on what that bilateral money actually represents. Is that a federal now covering of a portion of previously announced provincial money, or is this new federal money? The final line speaks to what was announced 2 weeks ago by the Prime Minister and then formally announced a week ago in terms of amounts, in terms of what's called the federal Safe Start monies. So what the federal government has announced nationally is that it will allocate $19 billion to support the safe restart of the economy and communities. Of that $19 billion, $625 million will be allocated by the federal government to provinces to support safe restart. So based on a per capita calculation, Alberta's share of that money should be around $60 to $65 million. So I think there was one question asked of the minister today around that federal restart money, but at the moment, I'm not aware of any direction that the province has provided in terms of how it will use federal restart money to support reopening and recovery. And so just concluding on that amount, thinking about it again, if we've got $1 billion sector that's been closed down for 2 months, has been partially trying to reopen for 2 months, what level of public investment do we believe is required to reopen and safely restart that sector? If we believe that safe reopening and recovery is going to look different than the pre-COVID environment in terms of levels of enrollment, staff-child interactions, health and safety and cleaning, what public investments are going to support that difference? When we look at early living and childcare and its recovery, somebody is going to have to pay to retain and support the sector. The question is who and in what amount. So if we can have the last slide, Laura. The information that Tara and I have covered, and we're happy to answer questions in respect to, relates to 3 main documents. The first one is the National Pandemic Survey itself, which I would encourage you to read. It explains to you what happened across Canada. And the question is, why would Alberta be different? What is it in Alberta that makes our sector different in terms of how it fared during the pandemic? The second document is the Muttart Foundation and Canadian Childcare Federation summary, if you like, from the Alberta perspective. How did Alberta's early learning and childcare sector fare? And then the third document is a more graphically more interesting summary of the second document, which includes some charts. So I'll end there, and then Tara and I are happy to try to respond to any questions that you may have. But thank you for your time and interest.
Laura, are you able to bring up maybe the highlight sheet that I think it has some good quotes from the sector. We learned so much from this report, just putting it together and hearing the voices of the sector. So,
yep, just give me a second here. All my system decides to cooperate.
As Laura's pulling that up, I know it's maybe a silly question, but can maybe one of you describe a little bit or explain what is meant by bilateral funding? What is that funding?
Okay, so it's not a silly question, Lisa. So in 2017, what the Liberal government did, the Liberal government developed something called the Multilateral Early Learning and Childcare Framework Agreement. And through that agreement, it made a long-term commitment to flow monies to the provincial and territorial governments to support investments in early learning and childcare. So each provincial and territorial government was then required to develop its own agreement with the federal agreement to get its share of the federal monies. So in Alberta, what we did, we developed our Alberta bilateral agreement for 3 years and said we would receive $45.6 million a year, and we will use it primarily to support the early learning and childcare sectors. So the bilateral agreement is the individual agreement each province or territory developed with a federal agreement to access the federal monies.
Perfect, thank you, Christopher.
So if people do have questions, we'll use the same kind of format we have. You can either post it into the question box and one of us will read it out for you, or if you want to put your hand up, then Laura will invite you to turn or unmute your microphone and ask your questions. So feel free to use either of those methods if you do have questions or comments to make or anything like that. I mean, we also want to know, does this resonate with people's experience? Does this, you know, do people feel like this reflects what their pandemic experience has been? Are there other issues that you see coming up for you that maybe you didn't hear reflected that maybe Tara or Christopher could, since they've gone through those documents in a great deal of detail, could comment on? So please feel free to use the question box or use the hand up function if you do want to make a comment or a question.
Yes, so there is a couple questions. I apologize if things go screwy on the screen here and some technical difficulties. So Bernice Taylor, it looks like she has a comment as well as a question. So her comment is, lower enrollment is causing centers to come up with ingenuitive programming, but unfortunately is going to result in competitive direction to attract parents. This does not create a supportive workforce for each other. Additionally, staff will migrate to a center with higher enrollment or benefits, etc., for stability, which is disappointing to hear. But question from Bernice is, will Muttart at some point this fall go back to the sector to ask these questions again to see as a comparison how things have improved / changed with either stimulus funding, federal program funding, etc.?
That's a really good question, Bernice, and I know Bernice from old, so thanks, Bernice. Nationally, there has been discussion around now, should the three partners, Childcare Now, the Federation, and the Childcare Resource and Research Unit, should we now do a reopening and recovery survey? Should we go out and collect information again, as Bernice suggested? In a particular reference, we can say, okay, we asked you 6 weeks into pandemic how things are going. We now need to come back and ask you the same questions. The answer at the moment, Bernice, is a maybe. It's a very complex process to do. What me, Muttart, and others, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say to the provincial governments, aren't you collecting this information? Within your jurisdiction is not the ministry. Do you not have the resources now to reach out to the stakeholders? And to pick up on Leah's questions, well, should you not be asking the stakeholders now, what do you need to support reopening and recovery? So it may happen nationally, Bernice, but we're actually hoping that individual provincial and territorial governments will be seized by the enormity of this challenge, will be seized by the importance of speaking directly and engaging stakeholders and asking their advice for how are you doing and what is needed to help you reopen and recovery. So I would hope that the provincial government, which is collecting data on number of centres that are open, levels of enrolment, I would hope it's also asking for key information on how does the government support you as part of this reopening and recovery process. Because as Tara said, if you look at the highlight sheet and you look at the survey, the individuals who responded to the survey, and I should imagine many of you were part of that response, you provided really important information that can help governments understand what's required. It can also help the sector itself understand what's required. So maybe the three organizations will do it, Bernice, but it would be great if the provincial and federal government, it'd be great. We've also talked about this with Minister Hussein, say, well, can the federal government now look at this area and try to understand what's needed to help the early learning and childcare sector recover? If the federal government's going to invest $625 million in something, what are you going to invest in? How are you going to make those decisions around what are the priorities? And this is some of the things I think Minister Schultz has spoken to about engaging stakeholders to provide information on what's needed. So I hope those avenues for engagement become clear because I'm not sure the sector fully understands what they currently are.
There's another, oh, do you want to go ahead, Laura?
Nope, all you.
Okay. There's another question in here, and I'm not sure, Christopher, if we actually know an answer to this. Lynn says, when I look at the early years investments in BC, it seems they are supporting centers and ECEs more comprehensively. Is the BC bilateral deal different on a per capita basis? I don't know if that's information that's available.
So what happened during the pandemic, you're absolutely right. So the BC government, along with a number of other governments, did support its early learning and childcare sector differently during the pandemic. The BC bilateral agreement also looks different. So each province and territory had a different bilateral agreement, but the BC government during the pandemic, the one thing that it did that I think the stakeholders expressed an interest in and asked the minister to consider here, what they did in BC, they introduced a temporary emergency operating allowance. So they introduced some form of supply side funding to organizations to meet fixed costs. So if you think about how Alberta funds early learning and childcare, if you look at the provincial budget, the two major items are subsidies at $180 million and wage enhancements at 125. Now, both of those are important, but if centers are closed, there's no subsidy money being provided and there's no wage enhancements being provided. So in those provinces that provide supply side funding to support a portion of operating costs, they had a vehicle to quickly transition to during the pandemic. They could say, we do supply side funding. We fund organizations to deliver services. In Alberta, we do not fund organizations to deliver services. And that funding model, I think it made it more difficult for us to respond to the pandemic. Then I think the government of Alberta's perspective was that the early learning and childcare sector in many ways should be treated exactly the same as other business sectors. That is, what the early learning and childcare sector should do is look to the federal government for support for staff through CERB or EI, or it should look for the Canada Emergency Business Account, it should look for the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program. The provincial government standpoint was that the early learning and childcare sector is in some ways similar to tourism, to recreation, to restaurants, in that it doesn't merit a particular government support. So I think there's very different perspectives from different provinces. And if you look at what was really surprising in some ways, you look at the maritime provinces, Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia and Quebec as well, they provided their early learning and childcare sectors with all of their pre-COVID government funding. They said, we're just sending you the money to keep you whole during the pandemic. And so if you look then and back in the data and you see, okay, so which provinces are now going to be in a better place to recover? Which provinces didn't lay off staff? It's those provinces that provided that direct funding support to organizations to allow them to remain financially viable, not open, because 8 out of 10 provinces closed their early learning childcare centers. So they weren't open, but they received their provincial government funding. So thank you for the question.
Okay. So Nida, sorry, I can never pronounce your last name, Nida. I'm not going to try to butcher it. This was a very disappointing announcement. This should have been the time to announce a universal child care system that would have helped to support all families, eliminate all barriers and inequities. Very true.
And I think Anida's referring to the bilateral announcement today. So, and you're right, Nida. I think the longer term strategy on behalf of the federal government does remain one of supporting pan-Canadian systems of early learning and childcare. But there's and you all know this, there's a mountain of research in terms of how do you build early learning and childcare systems? How do you actually physically, and in terms of public investments, how do you create systems? And you don't create systems by giving small amounts of money to parents. So if we were building a highway, an infrastructure system, we were building a bridge or hard infrastructure in Alberta, we wouldn't say to Albertans, here's your handful of gravel or your bucket of cement, go ahead and build a system. If we were building a transit system, we wouldn't buy everybody a bus pass. We would invest in the physical infrastructure and the services that deliver programs that children and family need. So if we're going to build an early learning and childcare system, we need to move to much more of a supply side funding model, and we need public management. In the announcement today in terms of subsidies, again, we can debate what is the merit of increasing subsidies or changing subsidies. And I think we would all like to feel as though families with low incomes have equitable access to early learning and childcare. But through subsidies, unless you also publicly manage and look at fees, and you publicly support services to deliver programs that families need, then you're not going to move that far ahead forward. One of the key elements of the $25 a day program was not just the fact that families received $25 a day childcare. It was also that services were supply side funded to provide high quality programs and services. And by moving towards a focus on parent subsidies, and again, I'm not going to argue that parents don't need affordable childcare, but moving towards a parent subsidy model, you're unlikely in the long run to provide those families who need it most with access to affordable, high quality early learning childcare. If I look at the new subsidy amounts that were announced, so they're large sums, so $750 a month for an infant space, right? But what's the median cost of an infant space in Calgary? The median cost of an infant space in Calgary is $1,300 a month. So a family on a low income of less than $50,000 a year who gets a subsidy of $750 a month, where are they going to come up with the extra $550 a month to access that infant space? So the subsidy model needs to be matched with public management around the fees that early learning and childcare centers provide and family day homes, and that needs to be matched with supply side funding to support the effective delivery of services. So you can't just look at subsidies in isolation of other key funding and infrastructure elements.
And I think their way of presenting that is a little bit misleading, because they're saying, you know, under the ELCC pilot program, people were paying $25 a day. And now if you look at our subsidy, they're going to be paying $17 a day, and whatever their numbers are. But one of the really big impacts that the ELCC program made was that the $25 a day, the cost of that to a family was the same as the maximum subsidy that a low-income family could get. So the lowest income families were paying nothing for their childcare. And that opened up a whole range of accessibility for the most vulnerable children and families to access childcare and the workforce in ways that they couldn't before. And so to now say, oh, families will be paying less, I find a little bit disingenuous, because they're really not. Because this subsidy doesn't, for any families, cover the entire cost of childcare, like you said, Christopher. It still leaves a large gap that families, even at the lowest income levels, have to cover to enable them to access childcare.
Yeah, and I think the bigger discussion layer, as you've highlighted there, is the question is, in early learning and childcare, if we're ever going to advance and support a workforce, we need to remunerate and support that workforce in a way that reflects its value and its contribution. If we're unable to break that connection between parent fees and ECE wages, then whenever we try to raise ECE wages, we will look at raising parent fees. And so in terms of the funding model, we need to break that unhealthy connection. We do not need to pit parents who are struggling to afford childcare against ECEs who are trying their best to provide high quality early learning and childcare at low rates of remuneration. And this is no different from any other jurisdiction across the world. No jurisdiction has built a system of early learning and childcare on what we call demand side funding. No system, no country has built a system of early learning and childcare relying primarily on a market. It's never happened. So if we believe in Albertan exceptionalism, and we believe we're going to do that in Alberta, then I've got some nice real estate in Florida that I'd also like you to interest you in.
Well, don't go there. That's a whole other set of problems.
But I really appreciate it, Christopher, how you keep bringing us back, and with the examples that you gave us about the system building. And I think that's something that, with everything that gets thrown at me personally, sometimes it kind of goes to the back of my mind, but thank you for bringing it back to the forefront of the need for that system building. And it's great, that there is funding, 100%, that it's coming from potentially these different directions, and there might be some here and there might be some there, but is this just another way to band-aid fix the problem, where we're throwing a couple dollars here, a couple dollars there, as opposed to actually really building that system that you talked about in a way that's not, I love the example you used, giving everybody a bit of gravel and saying, okay, come on, let's build this highway together now. So thank you very much for that.
And I think that's such a good analogy, because thinking about early learning and childcare as infrastructure and not an extra, that we expect that our governments are going to build and maintain the infrastructure we need to have the quality of life that they say we should be having here and that we want to have here. And early learning and childcare is a part of that. It's not just sort of a thing that gets tossed in when there's time and money and space, but it's part of that social infrastructure. And I think, I don't know how much everybody hears this, but being in the field, that's come out a lot during the pandemic, that this is more than just, sometimes people need this. This is part of the social fabric of how we have built our society and how we have, structured our quality of life and how people are working. And so it needs to be seen as that, as part of that infrastructure in terms of the system building. And And that's kind of what I heard from the announcement today too, was a lot of this sort of piecemeal, we'll have a little over here and a little over here and a little over there, but there wasn't sort of an overarching picture of, and here's how we're going to support this to continue so that everybody has access to all of these pieces that are moving.
And these aren't new, oh, sorry, Chris. These aren't new challenges. We've been faced with this for years. So, and when I look at things, it's that lack of planning, that comprehensive planning, so that things tie together. Someone said in one of the interviews, so that we don't just keep bolting on programs, that we have that foundation. The educated workforce is one of the strongest foundations you could build, but they have to be remunerated and supported appropriately. But it's a lack of planning, and maybe that stakeholders aren't being engaged in those higher level discussions to think about what a new plan might look like, whether it's how the goals for early learning and care, how it's financed, how it's delivered. Could we be part of those discussions? But I am proud of this sector because through the pandemic, so many more educators have stepped up and truly understand all the pieces of the puzzle and are able to lead discussions in this area. So I am very proud of this sector.
I think a very big comment, Leah, picking up on what you said, and I'm pretty pleased to be presenting with three such talented women. I mean, the pandemic, its impacts have been profound on women. There are tremendous sets of gender equity issues here. If we look at who lost their jobs, women were much more likely to lose their jobs than men. Who are the primary carers in early learning and childcare and long-term care? These are women. And so the thought or the hope was nationally is that as we started thinking about recovery, governments at all levels would be particularly seized by the need to look at issues of gender, the conditions of women. Single parents are still primarily women. The early learning and childcare is dominated by women. The women who were laid off in the service industries, these are the ones who are not going to find employment in the meantime. And I think there was an excellent op-ed by Emma Hayes in the Calgary Herald that some of you may have seen. And it raised a very provocative question politically. It says, is the government of Alberta, is it misogynist? Is it not attending to the needs of women? Does it not understand and care and attend to the needs of women? So I think from the standpoint of early learning and childcare, there are very important sets of social justice questions about how are women being treated. How have the impacts of the pandemic fallen on them? If you looked at who picked up the caring for long-term care, seniors, family members, if you look who's looking at the caring for children, it's women. If you look who's in the formal caring professions, the formal caring sector, it's women. If you look who's been impacted disproportionately by the loss of jobs and income, it's women. So the response to the pandemic should have a gender lens. And I've certainly heard federal ministers. I've heard Minister Monsef, federal minister, speak to this. I've heard Deputy Prime Minister Freeland speak to it. I've heard Minister Carolyn Bennett. I think federally, I've heard people really understand that female gender dimension of recovery. I've not heard it in Alberta. It doesn't seem to be something that the government at this point really understands or is prepared to speak to in a way with any authority or authenticity. And I think that's a real failing going forward. I think that's something that the government needs to think through very carefully.
Awesome, thank you guys. I do have about 4 or 5 more questions, and we may go over time a little bit here. So I have somebody with their hand up, which if you have your hand up and you do not have a question, I just ask that you lower it. Otherwise, I'll rotate through your names and unmute you as I go. So, Audette, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, you're unmuted. Odette, comment? Okay, I will move on to the next then. So one of the questions in the question box from Amadaiki, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. So this bilateral funding ends in 2021, and Alberta is ending this federal contract, meaning the end to the current $25 per day. Do you know if there will be a renewal of this bilateral funding?
So what will happen is Alberta's will negotiate and sign this one-year rollover. They now are starting the process for the negotiation of the next 3-year bilateral. So those discussions are starting to take place. If not now, they're starting to take place very soon. So Alberta will negotiate another 3-year bilateral agreement, which I would hope the sector would provide input and comment on in terms of the priorities that are needed. So there will be another 3-year bilateral agreement again negotiated starting, and that new agreement will commence effective April 1, 2021.
Thanks, Christopher. So another question, having a national view, are you seeing any regions that are able to pivot or to co-innovate during the recovery? And what is behind that ability to co-innovate? And that's from Mary Frances Smith.
Actually, I think BC is doing the best in some ways, and it's partly because the BC, going into the pandemic, the BC government had a provincial plan for a universal affordable system of childcare. So as Tara said, it's very hard to innovate and move forward if you don't have a plan. Tell me where you're trying to get to, and then the innovations will allow you to get to. So BC is making very significant progress. It's encountering significant challenges because how do you build an early learning and childcare system? For one thing, where are you going to get the early child educators from? So, but it's making progress. And then the two, what's interesting, PEI, one of the smallest provinces in Canada, has also wrapped its head around affordable early learning and childcare system. So what's key is that planning work. And what's so disappointing is Alberta did that planning work 8 years ago. So under a previous provincial government, the Muttart Foundation, United Ways, and AECEA and others, we met with stakeholders across the province, and we talked about an Alberta framework for early learning and childcare. In 2013, the government launched, Conservative government under Premier Redford with Minister Hancock leading the charge, launched a Together We Raise Tomorrow, an Alberta plan for early childhood development. So you need the big plan. You need to do the hard thinking, and then you can innovate within the plan, but you've got to know where you're trying to get to.
Thank you. So another question from Bernice Taylor. The announcement today was clear that this funding is for 1 year. Do you feel that during this year there will be a move toward discussion for national childcare plans, which are equal province to province? Is there a concern that they only went with a 1 year agreement this year?
There's two concerns, Bernice. One, the 1 year agreements. And so at the moment, that's my understanding, having talked to ESDC, Employment Social Development Canada about a week ago, 5 agreements have signed and 5 are pending. And the 1 year agreements, the phrase that was used was the federal government's been quite flexible with the provinces in terms of how they use the money. So the money, I think, will be, as maybe Leah described it, provinces will just do a few things, here and there. The larger strategy of building a pan-Canadian system or systems of early learning and childcare, I think increasingly is going to rest on federal leadership. And what the federal government seems to be doing, it seems to be saying, we don't want to provide too much leadership in an area of provincial jurisdiction. So as you all know, in terms of the way government relations and responsibilities are divided, early learning and childcare is an area of provincial jurisdiction. So what the federal government does, it has some ability to participate and engage, but at the moment it seems to be a little bit reluctant. So the sense, Bernice, is from 2017, when the multilateral framework agreement was announced, at that time, and we can draw our own conclusions from this, at that time in 2017, there were more early learning and childcare friendly provincial governments than there are now. So in Ontario, we had the Kathleen Wynne government committed to early learning and childcare. It's now been replaced by the Doug Ford government. In Alberta, in 2017, we had the NDP Rachel Notley government. So it seems as though provincially, the governments are less friendly to early learning and childcare than they were 3 years ago. And I think that's something that's difficult. The only government that's more friendly than it was 3 years ago is the BC government, and that's an NDP Green coalition. And so I think we're actually struggling a little bit on the national level in terms of advancing system building, given that we have provincial governments that aren't as comfortable or aren't as friendly towards this fire. What we need in Canada, we talk about the big four. We have 4 big provinces. We have Alberta, BC, Ontario, and Quebec. The federal government needs those big 4 provinces to support its initiatives. And at the moment, there's only one of the big 4 provinces which is really on side in terms of early learning and childcare, in terms of national system building, and that's BC. And Quebec is on side for early learning and childcare, but is following the usual federal provincial model in terms of Quebec relations, what we call asymmetrical federalism, whereby Quebec receives money to support provincial services without federal direction, if you like. So we need Ontario and Alberta to be strong supporters of early learning and childcare within federation. And so we need early learning and childcare sectors in Alberta and Ontario to tell their provincial governments that this is a paramount area of responsibility. I thought it was quite interesting when the Premier announced his recovery restart plan prior to the federal initiative, and he announced the money. There was no mention of early learning and childcare at all. It was not a priority provincially. And the federal government hears that, right? They hear that. They hear what provincial governments are saying in terms of their area priorities. So we need provincial governments to speak, to use the minister's word, we need them to speak boldly and strongly in support of early learning and childcare. At the moment, I don't feel as though they're doing that.
Thanks, Christopher. So we are starting to lose some attendees. Are you guys okay? I have 2 more questions and 1 comment to bring up. Christopher, Sarah, Leah,
Yep.
Lisa, you guys all good? Okay.
Yep.
I will take these last 2 questions and read out that 1 comment. And then if you do have any further questions, feel free to email the AC office at info@aecea.ca, and I'll make sure it gets forwarded on to the Muttart. So we will start off with one of the questions here. Do we have any idea what type of funding would come from the federal government after the 3-year agreement? So, and that's from Marilyn Boisvert. I'm not 100% whether she's referencing amount of funding or what that would look like, though. So Marilyn, if you could type that in, that would be great.
Okay, so Marilyn, hi Marilyn, how are you? Hope it's nice up in Northern Alberta. So what we know is, so the 1-year rollover, we know that now. And now we know they're negotiating the next round of 3-year agreements. What we do know, we have a fairly good idea on what the money will be in those next set of 3-year agreements. So we know what Alberta's money will be, and it'll be pretty much similar to what's been in place so far. There may be a small increase. But what we don't know is we don't know what particular areas of priority the Alberta government will set out. What I would suggest to you today is the Alberta government set out what its priorities will be for investment in the next 3-year agreement that starts April 1, 2021. As part of the announcement today, I think the words the minister used was that the early learning and childcare centres have come to their natural conclusion. I think we're out of the $25 a day business. And I think what we're into is primarily a focus on demand side subsidy funding for parents. So I do not believe that the announcement today is going to be significantly different from the announcement of a proposed another 3-year bilateral that starts April 1, 2021, unless the sector or other voices are going to be engaged in saying what should that next bilateral agreement look like. What was really disappointing is in the first bilateral agreement under the Notley government, I don't know how many of you were ever consulted on what the bilateral agreement should include, but the NDP government also made a very poor job of engaging the sector in terms of asking them what was needed to move the sector forward. What the NDP government essentially did was use the federal money to support its campaign election promise of $25 a day childcare, again, there was little or no stakeholder engagement. And so myself and many others, we've been saying to the federal government and to provincial governments, you need to engage your stakeholders in terms of talking about what are the funding priorities for federal investments. These are important public dollars. Why would stakeholders not have an opportunity to inform the expenditure of these dollars? If we think back to the UCP election platform, and it won't take us long, what was in the platform in terms of the priorities for early learning and childcare? Answers on a post, there was nothing. There was no statement. So we do not know what the UC government's priorities were in terms of investing in early learning and childcare. They didn't identify any in the platform. So we need to be clear what those priorities are. Are the priorities to support affordability for low and middle income families? Well, if that's the priority, then we need to be able to assess what the investments that you're currently making, what are they delivering in terms of outcomes? So could centers talk to families? Could the $25 a day sites who are reaching their natural conclusion talk to their families and say, what happens on April 1, 2021? Are you still going to be here, or are you going to leave because you can't afford to be in childcare anymore? We could start collecting that information now. That information could then be made available to the ministry to support its decision making. Wouldn't that be kind of a good way of assessing the value of a public policy initiative?
Thanks, Christopher. So I lied. It looks like we do not have another question, just a comment from Shirley Rempel. I am an approved family day home provider, and absolutely COVID affected me. I lost about half my income over the last 4 months, but was very grateful to receive the wage enhancement and the $250 to help with cleaning and health costs.
And I think this is an interesting question. I think, it was interesting that family day homes stayed open, right? So the family day homes that stayed open were able to access the wage enhancements, and parents who access family day homes were able to access the subsidies. So those funding models worked for you if you stayed open. I hope, Shirley, that when recovery takes place, that the enrollment that you need to be financially viable returns, because that's a really important question that we need to be able to ask, and we need to be able to answer with some degree of certainty. Because at the moment, businesses, whether they're small family day home operators or whether they're larger centers, they're not sure on what their revenue model looks like come the fall. They're not sure what their cost model looks like. And so in the absence of that certainty, it's very hard to plan and make good business and service decisions.
And I think, Christopher, what as you've been speaking, what it's really brought up for me is that call to action piece, that really need to investigate more and to research more for myself and to find out, because what you and Tara have shared this evening has been very beneficial even for me to hear and to get explained, to go through. It's all very complex funding. I think I'll speak for myself anyway. So, but really that call to action, that these are these evolving changes, and how do we become a part of that, and how do we have a voice in that, so that others are not making that decision for us, that we can have that voice and that say in the direction of our profession is going, as well as where our tax dollars are being spent.
Yeah, I think in this day and age, it's incredibly important that governments are transparent in terms of how public money is used. And it's really important in terms of they're transparent about what outcomes, good and bad, came from that public money. And I think that's what's absolutely critical. What the UCP government said is that the $25 a day initiative didn't work. It didn't deliver what Alberta's needed. So that kind of analysis now needs to be brought to the policy initiatives that the government brings forward. And governments shouldn't be beaten up for trying things. What government should be beaten up for is trying dumb things. So if there's a body of evidence that suggests that something isn't working very well, and you keep doing that, then at some point there is some accountability to stakeholders. And the field of early learning and childcare, what's absolutely critical is we are dealing with the most vulnerable populations. We're dealing with little people and their families And we're dealing with workforces that are traditionally marginalized and treated not well. So there is an extra public responsibility in this area to attend to the needs of vulnerable populations and to address issues of social justice.
If that's indeed the goal of early learning and care in this province. So when we go back to planning and maybe setting out those goals and looking at the outcomes at the end of the day, what were our goals in the first place for this? Is it about the little children and the families, or is it about something different, I guess? So I think we all have a role to play in some of that planning and thinking through the complexity of this work. But pieces, well, the survey results helps us to do that. So it is important for people to participate in that type of process so we could keep learning about this sector. And even how it ties into decisions made within education or some of the other areas that intersect with our work. So it is complex. Every day, Lisa, I know you say you keep learning every time we all talk. We do that on a daily basis. Christopher and I learn all the time something new that impacts our work and that we have to dig deeper on. So.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was awesome, and we really appreciate your expertise and your wisdom to kind of break that down. And I think all of us are walking away with a bit of a new perspective on that, and hopefully some new ideas about who we can share this information with, and sort of how to bring our questions forward so that government also knows that we're going to ask questions and that we want to know more, and that you know, we want to know what's underneath the announcements they make when they're putting these things forward. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you. And if you're anything like me, just a reminder that the webinar tonight has been recorded. So if you need to go back and take some notes or rewatch, get clarification, or share with your friends and colleagues, definitely we'll be able to do so there. Just before we hop off, I did want to say, if you do want to support AECEA's work and continuing what they do, please consider getting a membership with us. You can hop on over to the website, and your membership really does help with all of these initiatives and us being able to further our advocacy work for educators in Alberta. But thank you so much, Tara and Christopher. It's been absolutely amazing having you with us here this evening. And thank you to all the exceptional educators who have joined us on a summer Thursday or Thursday evening tonight.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.